Hi. So this mic, ooh, I'm mic'd. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Cordelia. I'm Cordelia Dillon on the internet. I am an accessibility engineer. I've been an accessibility engineer at a few companies. Right now I'm at Dropbox, leading their web accessibility initiative. But what I wanted to talk about today is computer tutoring at senior centers. I want to talk a lot about designing with senior citizens in mind. So I've been tutoring in my free time at computer labs around San Francisco for about 4 years now. These are mostly senior centers for homeless or recently homeless seniors in Soma and the Tenderloin. And there are a lot of interesting access issues there, both around financial access to technology, but also around as you age, your needs for technology change. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that user group today and some things that I've learned from working with them. So first, how many people have seen this phrase, "so easy your grandmother could do it"? Yeah, so the way that I feel about this phrase is kind of the skeptical thinking face for a lot of reasons. One reason being that I think there's this assumption that older users are less advanced and that we need to dumb things down for them, which really isn't true. A lot of the seniors I work with in the senior centers used to be programming on punch cards like way back before I was born, but they're struggling with modern interfaces. And it's not because they're dumb, it's because these interfaces haven't really been designed with them in mind. So I think we need to challenge this notion and challenge this idea of intuitive user experiences. So I think a lot of us in the Bay Area are often trying to design the perfect intuitive user experience, but the question becomes, who is it intuitive for? I think this is grammatically correct, right? A whom and not a who? Yeah, okay, great. So the question is, when we're designing things, for whom is it intuitive? Because honestly, we live in the Bay Area, and a lot of UIs are designed and built by young, able-bodied people. I am a young, able-bodied person, and I think what often kind of happens when you are a certain type of person and you're building things for other people is you end up building things for people who are like you. So if we take, for example, Facebook was built by and for college students. It started out even really small for one single college, and now has since expanded to be like the main social network. So they've had to, I don't know if anyone here works at Facebook, but they've had to really change their whole user experience to now support multiple different nationalities, multiple age groups. One of my favorite stats about Facebook is on this graph here, which hopefully you can see. But this is showing how Facebook demographics have changed from 2011 to 2014. So this data is now a little bit out of date. I'd love to get new data. But basically what this is showing is the percentage of teenagers and college students on Facebook went down over a 3-year span, but the percentage of people 55 years and older totally went up. So it grew by 80%. So senior citizens and people over the age of 55 are the fastest growing demographic of Facebook users, and actually in numbers surpass the number of teenagers on Facebook, which is pretty wild. So that leads me to, how do we design with these users in mind? Today I'm going to be talking about this in 3 different dimensions of motor, visual, and cognitive. I am leaving out another really important dimension, which is audio accessibility, and I will be talking more about that later today. But these are the 3 things that come up most often in the senior labs where I volunteer, so I wanted to focus on these and some specific moments that I've learned from throughout the way. So let's start with motor accessibility. So this is really important because as we age, all of our senses start to slow down a little bit. And if we used to be very dexterous, our dexterity starts to go. It may be a little bit harder to do precision tasks. And I think a really great example of that is the double click. So in one of the computer labs where I volunteer, I was teaching a woman how to open up a program on Windows using double click. So you double click on the icon to open up the program. And so she clicked once, and then she clicked a second time, and the computer interpreted that as 2 separate clicks. But it was in fact 2 clicks, and it was just a little bit challenging for her to do it twice in a row. So a lot of times we talk about timing being everything, but it really shouldn't be everything because every user moves at their own speed. So something that I've learned from this, which is a general accessibility principle, is to kind of give users some wiggle room. So making sure that they have flexible multi-part interactions. For example, if you're double clicking, make sure that they have enough time to do that action and that it won't be mistaken for something else. The same with like drag and drop. Drag and drop can be really challenging for folks, so maybe you want to give them an alternate way to move something around the page because that requires a lot of precision. And in the same vein as making some wiggle room, making sure that you have large click and tap targets. Think about 48 pixels. Last time I checked, that's a pretty good size for buttons, especially as we move more and more to touch screens. A lot of times what will happen is people will try and tap on one thing and they accidentally tap on another thing and it's a disaster. So making sure that buttons are kind of far apart from each other so that people won't accidentally tap on anything. And then logically, so this gets into probably the only code sample I'll show today, logically linked inputs and labels. And what I mean by that is if we consider here, one of my seniors was filling out I think it was an iMessage to a friend of his, and he kept trying to tap on the word subject to type the subject, because here it's not clear necessarily where you need to tap to start writing. Maybe it's in the white space after subject, maybe it's not. Where does that white space end? So when you're writing HTML, it's really important to use this for attribute on the label to associate it with the input field so that if someone taps on or clicks on the label, they're going to then focus the input field. If that were just a sort of unassociated label, tapping on the word subject would do nothing. So you want to make sure that people have these large tap targets that they can know, okay, I can tap in this empty space, I can tap on the word, I can basically tap on any of this and start typing. Moving on to visual, and again, I'm only sort of scratching the surface because it's a lightning talk, but these are a few things that I've seen come up time and time again that are things that we can change in our UIs that will really, really help senior citizens, but also just help everyone. So moving on to visual, again, as we age, our vision starts to go a little bit. I definitely have experienced that already, and I'm pretty young. So how can we make sure that we have great visual experiences for all our users? And I'll do a quick little side story here that also has to do with cognitive ability, which is probably the saddest day at the senior citizen lab, where a man was trying to type in his username and password into Yahoo Mail. He typed in his username and he typed his password incorrectly and it failed. He typed his password again incorrectly and failed. I came over and I asked, hey, is that, because he was writing it down from a piece of paper, it had a zero, it had like a circle on his piece of paper, and I said, is that a zero or an O? And he said, does it matter? And I said, yes, it does matter. So we finally got him to type in the correct password after multiple attempts, and then he got CAPTCHA. And this was really, really challenging for him to try and figure out what does all this squiggly text mean. And I, being the tutor, was conflicted about should I fill it out for him or should I let him fill it out? And so visually this was really challenging. And finally, after going through like 10 different CAPTCHAs, the computer was like, you've tried too many times and failed, so I'm just going to log you out for a day. You can't log in for another day. And that was really, really discouraging. So make sure that content is legible on the web. I think we can all agree that CAPTCHA is just a bad pattern, but it's an anti-pattern, but it's especially really, really bad for people who can't necessarily discern what the letters are. Make sure you're not using teeny tiny fonts or thin fonts. This is actually probably too thin of a font to use on the web. So make sure you're not using this font on the web. And really embrace color contrast. Color contrast can actually be a really, really great thing. Embrace using responsive UIs. And again, action proximity, so you don't want buttons to be right up on each other so that people accidentally tap on the wrong things, but you want them to be close enough that people don't have to scroll back and forth through the page trying to figure out where they're supposed to go. And then embrace text itself. So for example, there are a lot of websites that use iconography like this, and who knows what this arrow means out of context? Yeah, I like that expression back there. No, I have no idea. So that can be really challenging for folks. So often, just putting text next to an icon makes it so much better for everyone. And usually on mobile, it's pretty easy to just add in that text too. I know we like to save space, but it really, really helps. It especially helps in UIs where you have, say, 10 different types of arrows that all mean different things. Again, I was working with an iPad and one of the seniors in the lab, and he had a lot of trouble telling what all these different icons meant, especially when a lot of them were light gray. They really didn't make much sense. So making sure things are high contrast, making sure you're providing text, whether that be through a tooltip on the web or just putting the text in there on mobile, can do a great deal, again, for senior citizens, but really for all of your users. And this moves us into cognitive, which is actually super related, is how do you know what's on this page? So again, as we age, our cognitive abilities start to kind of get a little bit worse, but also even more important than that is a lot of designers and developers, as I mentioned earlier, aren't really thinking about senior citizens when they're designing their products. So even if you have the brightest person who's 80 years old and super bright, they might be using an interface that's just using terminology that they're not familiar with because they are not a millennial. So cognitive is all about making sure that all users, regardless of their context, understand the UI that you're presenting to them and understand what they can do. So this was pretty fascinating to me, and this goes back to the guy writing down his password. The Nielsen Norman Group has done a lot of research around how senior citizens use the web, and they have this quote here from one of their studies that half of the seniors in their study said they kept a list of steps and instructions about how to use websites they need or often visit. So this means that if you do a redesign, you might be leaving out a lot of users. You might be, tripping up a lot of users because even the simplest thing is moving, say, a pop-up from one side of the screen to another side of the screen in a redesign, or maybe changing the color scheme, can really throw a lot of people off. Not to be a downer, but it can. So something to think about, and again, this is just a really great UX principle, is making sure you have consistent navigation patterns. Another example from an iPad is I was working with this senior who was getting really, really familiar with how to use an iPad. He was zooming around using iMessaging all the time. He was really, really an advanced iPad user, but he got to this screen. So basically, we were looking at the App Store, and he tapped on an app, and that opened up this little pop-up to show you more information about the app. And he was like, okay, I'm done looking at the app. How do I close this and go back to the list? And he couldn't see a close button. He couldn't figure out how to get out of it. And for me, I was like, oh yeah, you can tap in this empty space, but that tapping in the empty space doesn't seem like the way to get rid of something, is to just interact with anything else. So really, if there had just been a close button in the corner, which would be consistent with the other UIs that he'd navigated, that would have been really helpful to just be like, oh yeah, I can tap on close and that'll close the UI. Again, going back to this example we saw earlier with the Yahoo Mail, making sure you have clear, always available labels is super important as well for accessibility. So if I were to have these placeholder labels and then I write my name inside there, suddenly I don't know what that first field is. If I step away from my computer and step back, I might be like, was I supposed to write my first name, or was I starting to write my email address? What am I writing here? So making sure you have your labels outside of the form field, which again adds that benefit of, if I want to have a large tap or click target, I can tap on the word username, or I can tap on that whole field to focus inside of it. So really all of this is about reducing cognitive load for your users. You can do that through a lot of different things. What we just talked about was consistent navigational patterns, making sure you can close things consistently, making sure side navigation is the same, always having very clear, always available labels so people are never unsure about what action they're supposed to do next. Using instructions in plain language, which again gets back to this cognitive thing of if you're a millennial, you might have certain jargon that you use all the time. But if you are in any different generation, again, it doesn't have to be seniors. It could be if you have a 5-year-old using an app, which they increasingly are doing, they're going to navigate a lot differently and have a much different vocabulary than a 20-year-old or a 40-year-old. So just making sure that all the different types of people who can use your apps understand how to use it. And then, yeah, creating environments where users feel comfortable exploring. Like, how could we, going back to that UI of this thing, like, how could we make the guy feel comfortable tapping around to close this thing? What patterns could we change to make it easy to explore without feeling like you might accidentally ruin something or break something? So this has just been a quick little overview of a few different ways to think about accessibility, particularly in terms of the senior citizen experience, so people 65 and older. But I would argue that all of this is good UX for everyone. And I think that's all I've got today, because really what we're trying to do is make products that aren't just intuitive for some, but intuitive for all users of all ages, all contexts, all different abilities. And that's what I got for you. Thank you all. I'm so happy to be here. Happy Global Accessibility Awareness Week. Woo!
Any questions? Anybody? 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 I have one. Where the senior lab is that like a volunteer-based thing, or is it just like something you found? Like, do you have any resources where we might be able to volunteer?
Yes. So there is a really wonderful organization called Community Technology Network, and they are a nonprofit that sends computer tutors to a variety of senior centers around I think around the whole Bay Area. So giant plug for them. They're great. I've been volunteering through them for 4 years now, and they're really great. So if you're looking if you have like an hour a day or an hour every week or more than that, you can go to one of these senior centers and really like change someone's life. Like I've cried a lot, like good tears of like, wow, we really made a lot of progress here. Like, one time I helped a guy get on Facebook for the first time to find he got to see photos of his grandchildren who are in the Philippines, and like just that, like facilitating that connection was incredible. So I highly recommend it, and you don't have to be like a supercomputer user to volunteer there. You just need to be patient and kind to folks. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much. Oh, one more.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also, like, there's been a lot of work recently to make CAPTCHA more accessible in general. Like, now it's kind of a checkbox, and there's also an audio CAPTCHA and a few other things, but it's pretty bad. And also, on the cognitive load end, for people who aren't very familiar with computers, so for the guy who was trying to log into Yahoo Mail, Yahoo knew everything about him. They knew his age, they knew all his contacts, and yet they were asking him to prove that he was human, and that was like a very intense cognitive disconnect of, I am human. Why do you think that I'm not? Yeah.
I like that you emphasize the higher contrast, the thicker fonts, because it is amazing how Google, which goes ahead, supports the W3C's accessibility criteria, still is putting out lots of apps where you have pale gray on a white background with tiny font, and they themselves would not pass their own test.
Yes. One thing that I will say about that that's really interesting is, so if you've read the accessibility guide, the WCAG AA guidelines around color contrast, they have two levels for regular size text and large text in terms of color contrast, and large text is either large or a certain thickness. But I've noticed that there aren't any guidelines around how thin a font can be. And a lot of times fonts, like depending on your screen, end up being like less than a shrivel of a pixel. So you can't really see them. So I think that's like some interesting work we can do in the accessibility community, is try to create better guidelines around how to use text in a way that's legible in general. Yeah. But yeah, great point. Yeah. Oh, do you?
Yeah, just so we get
Okay.
it recorded. Sorry, I normally would walk faster, but I wasn't sure if he was going to yell before I got there. There you go.
Oh, yeah, just a comment about color scale. Because people are colorblind, the true standard is one of contrast on a grayscale if you don't see the color. And so even though color is a great add-on, you have to be careful not to rely on color. You know, I mean, that's one of the old things that people get the training on. One other thing I'd mention, there's so many great topics you touched on here, is that it's increasingly possible. I mean, accessibility movement for web pages in the late 1990s. It's not a new idea, and a lot of these things have been percolating for a long time. And to some extent, we have a problem where the technology and the capabilities move ahead of the old standards. But so the one thing I would say is that it's increasingly possible to have a whole continuum of things where you can provide people exactly what they need and what they want and have them able to switch to it, so that it's really not, there's been a huge improvement in responsive programming based on your device, but you also want to have responsive accessibility based on what the person actually prefers and is comfortable with. So that's all.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
Anyone else? All right. Thank you so much, Cordelia.